Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Baltimore, Maryland, 1969. It was the kind of city that never fully slept, factory whistles still cutting through the early morning fog. Church bells marking the hours in neighborhoods where everyone knew their neighbors by name, where front stoops were gathering places and parish life was the backbone of the community. It was a city of working people, of Catholic families, of routines so steady and reliable that when something broke that routine, the whole neighborhood felt it. And in the southwestern corner of that city, tucked inside a modest but warm apartment complex on Westgate Avenue, lived a young woman named Catherine Cesnik. She was 26 years old. She was a nun, she was a teacher, and she was, by every account of every person who ever crossed her path, one of the most genuinely kind human beings you could ever hope to meet. Catherine, or Sister Kathy as her students called her, was not the kind of nun that people imagined when they pictured religious life in the 1960s. She wasn't severe, she wasn't cold. She didn't rule her classroom with a ruler and a stern expression. She was the opposite of that. She was warm in a way that felt almost effortless, the kind of warmth that made teenagers difficult, guarded, self-conscious teenagers feel seen and understood. She taught English and drama at Archbishop Q High School, an all-girls Catholic school in Baltimore. And her students adored her in the way that students only adore the teachers who truly changed something in them. She wore her religious habit, but she also played guitar. She listened to her students talk about their problems and actually listened, not the polite, half-distracted listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but real, full-attention listening. She remembered birthdays. She remembered the names of students' siblings. She stayed late after school to help girls rehearse for plays she directed with genuine passion. Her students didn't just like her. They loved her. Some of them would carry her memory for the rest of their lives. And on the night of November 7, 1969, Catherine Cesnik walked out of her apartment to run a quick errand, a trip to a nearby shopping center just a few minutes away, and she never came back. To understand what happened to Catherine Cesnik, you have to understand the world she came from. She was born on April 26, 1943 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the daughter of a close-knit Polish-American family. Her given name was Joanne Catherine Cesnik, though everyone simply called her Catherine or Kathy. From the time she was a young girl, people noticed something about her, a quality that's hard to name precisely but easy to recognize when you see it, a kind of centered stillness, a genuine interest in other people, a faith that wasn't performed for the benefit of others but was simply, quietly, part of who she was. She grew up attending Catholic school, and somewhere along the way she felt what she described as a calling, a pull toward religious life that she followed not out of obligation or family pressure, but out of genuine conviction. She entered the School Sisters of Notre Dame, a religious order with deep roots in education, and she embraced that life with her whole heart. She was smart, deeply, seriously smart. She earned a degree in English, and she brought to her teaching not just warmth but genuine intellectual rigor. She cared about literature. She cared about language, she believed, in a way that her students absorbed almost without realizing it, that stories mattered, that the act of reading and writing and performing was not just an academic exercise, but a way of understanding what it meant to be human. By 1969, she had been teaching at Archbishop Q High School for several years, and had become one of its most beloved faculty members. She lived in an apartment on Westgate Avenue with a fellow nun and close friend, Sister Helen Russell Phillips, known as Russ, who was also a teacher at the school. The two women had built a quiet, comfortable life together, sharing meals, sharing conversation, navigating the particular freedoms and constraints of religious life in an era when the Catholic Church itself was changing rapidly in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council. It was a good life, a full life, a life that, from the outside, seemed as stable and safe as any life could be. But there were things happening beneath the surface of that stability, things at the school, things in the parish, things that Catherine had begun to become aware of. That would ultimately cost her everything. Archbishop Q High School sat in the southwestern part of Baltimore, a large brick building that served hundreds of young Catholic women from the surrounding neighborhoods. It was staffed by nuns from the School Sisters of Notre Dame, supplemented by lay teachers, and it was considered a good school, rigorous, faith-centered, respected, and attached to that school, deeply embedded in its spiritual life, was a chaplain. His name was Father A. Joseph Maskell. Joseph Maskell was in 1969 a young priest in his late 20s. He was charismatic in the particular way that makes people lower their guard, easy to talk to, seemingly attentive, skilled at making people feel that he genuinely cared about them. He had been appointed as the chaplain at CUF, and in that role he had direct, regular access to the students. He ran counseling sessions. He heard confessions. He positioned himself as a trusted confidant, a spiritual guide, someone the girls could turn to when they were troubled. He was also, according to what would eventually emerge decades later, a predator. The allegations against Father Maskell, which would not become public until the 1990s, which would be denied by the Archdiocese of Baltimore for years, which would be fought over in courtrooms and investigated by law enforcement, were of a severity that is genuinely difficult to sit with. Former students came forward describing systematic, repeated sexual abuse. Abuse that happened in the context of counseling sessions, in the context of confession, in sacred spaces that were supposed to be places of safety and healing. Abuse carried out by a man who used his position of spiritual authority to silence his victims, to make them doubt themselves, to make them believe that what was happening to them was somehow their fault, or was somehow sanctioned, or was something they simply had to endure. And some of those former students would later say with the weight of people who had carried this for decades, that Sister Kathy knew. That she had found out what was happening to the girls in her care, that she had been trying to do something about it, and that shortly after she began to act on what she knew, she disappeared. The evening of November 7, 1969 began quietly. Catherine had spent the day at the school, teaching her classes, going about her normal routine. By evening she was back at the apartment on Westgate Avenue. She and Russ had been living there for some time, and the apartment had taken on the comfortable, lived-in quality of a real home, books on the shelves, a guitar in the corner, the small accumulated evidence of two women building a life together within the framework of their religious vows. At some point that evening, Catherine decided to go out. It was a simple errand. She wanted to pick up an engagement gift. She was shopping for a present for her sister, who was recently engaged. There was a shopping center not far from the apartment, a place called Edmondson Village Shopping Center, and Catherine said she was going there. She was familiar with the route. It was not a long trip. It was the kind of errand you run without thinking twice about it, the kind of thing you expect to be back from within the hour. She left the apartment, she got into her car, and she drove away. Russ wasn't immediately alarmed when Catherine didn't return right away. Errands take longer than expected sometimes. Maybe she'd stopped to talk to someone. Maybe the store had been busy. There were 100 perfectly ordinary explanations for a slight delay, but the delay stretched and stretched. And by the time it became clear that Catherine had been gone far longer than any shopping trip should take, something cold and heavy began to settle in. Russ waited, and Catherine did not come back. When Catherine's absence could no longer be explained away, the alarm was raised. Sister Helen Russell Phillips contacted the school, contacted other members of the religious community, and the quiet ripple of concern began to spread. Catherine's car, a 1964 Volkswagen Beetle, was eventually found parked near the Westgate Shopping Center, not Edmondson Village as she had intended. This was a detail that investigators would note and puzzle over. Why was the car at Westgate rather than Edmondson Village? Had she changed her plans? Had someone redirected her? Had something happened before she even reached her original destination? The car was there. Catherine was not. Inside the car, investigators found a package, the engagement gift she had gone out to buy. She had made it to a store. She had completed at least part of her errand. She had bought the gift for her sister, and then, somewhere between the store and her car, or between her car and her apartment, Catherine Sesnick had vanished. The Baltimore City Police Department opened a missing persons investigation. The religious community was shaken, the school was shaken. Her students, those girls who loved her, who had rehearsed plays under her direction, who had talked to her about their hopes and fears and dreams, were shaken in a way that many of them would never fully recover from. Where was Sister Kathy? What had happened to her? The questions hung in the air over Westgate Avenue, over Archbishop Q High School, over the close-knit Catholic community of southwestern Baltimore, like smoke that wouldn't clear. And the answers, when they finally came, partial answers, terrible answers, would take nearly 2 months to arrive, and would raise more questions than they resolved. The weeks following Catherine's disappearance were marked by the particular agony of not knowing. Her family, her parents, her siblings, the people who had known her longest and loved her most deeply, were suspended in that terrible in-between space where you cannot grieve, because you don't yet know if there is something to grieve. But you cannot hope freely either, because the days keep passing and the silence keeps stretching, and every morning you wake up hoping that today will be the day the phone rings with good news. And every night you go to sleep having not received that call. The Baltimore police conducted searches. They interviewed people who knew Catherine, people who had seen her, people connected to the school and the parish. They retraced her likely route. They canvassed the neighborhoods around Westgate Avenue and the shopping centers. They found nothing that led them to her. The investigation stalled in the way that investigations stall when there are no witnesses, no clear evidence, no obvious leads pointing in a definitive direction. The case remained open, but with each passing week it received less active attention, as police resources were stretched and other cases demanded attention. The community prayed, the school held vigils. Her students lit candles and asked God to bring Sister Kathy home. And then, on January 3, 1970, nearly 2 months after she had walked out her apartment on that November evening, a young boy was walking through a field in the Lansdowne area of Baltimore County, just outside the city limits. He was not looking for anything in particular. He was just a boy, walking through a field in January in the cold gray light of a winter afternoon, and he found her. Catherine Sesnick's body was discovered in a trash-strewn field off Javanue in Lansdowne, Maryland. She had been there for weeks. The condition of her body, after nearly 2 months of exposure to the elements, made a precise forensic analysis difficult. The medical examiner determined that she had died from a blunt force trauma to the head. She had been struck, and struck hard, with something that caused a catastrophic injury. The exact nature of the weapon was not conclusively identified. She was 26 years old. She had gone out to buy an engagement gift for her sister, and she had ended up in a field in January, found by a child who hadn't been looking for anything at all. The discovery of her body transformed the missing persons case into a homicide investigation, and the Baltimore County Police Department, since the body had been found outside city limits, became involved alongside the Baltimore City Police. But the investigation, even now that it had a body, even now that it had a confirmed crime, did not quickly resolve itself into answers. There were questions about the timeline, about where Catherine had been for those 2 months, about whether she had been killed on the night she disappeared or at some later point, about who had known where she was, about why her body had ended up in that particular field, in that particular part of Baltimore County. And there was, from early on, a name that kept surfacing in connection with this case, a name that some people in the community had already been whispering, and that investigators would eventually come to focus on: Father A. Joseph Maskell. But before we go further into what the investigation uncovered, before we follow the trail of evidence and testimony and allegation that would eventually point investigators in a specific and deeply disturbing direction, I want to spend a little more time with Catherine herself, because it would be easy, in a case like this, for the victim to become swallowed by the darkness of what surrounds her story, for her to become simply a body in a field, a symbol of institutional evil, a plot point in a larger narrative about crime and cover-up and corruption. And Catherine Sesnick was so much more than that. The people who knew Catherine in life, her fellow nuns, her colleagues at the school, and especially her students, describe her in terms that are strikingly consistent. She was warm, she was genuine. She was funny in a quiet, dry way that caught people off guard. She took her faith seriously without taking herself too seriously. She believed deeply in the power of the arts, in theater, in literature, in music, to open people up to truths they couldn't reach any other way. She played guitar, and she brought that guitar into her teaching. In an era when Catholic education was still shaking off some of its more rigid traditions in the wake of Vatican II, Catherine represented something new, a religiosity that was alive and flexible, and connected to the real experiences of the young women she was teaching. She didn't want her experience to simply recite prayers by rote. She wanted them to think, to feel, to engage. She directed school plays with a seriousness and a joy that her students absorbed. Former students who were interviewed decades later by journalists, by documentary filmmakers, by researchers piecing together the story of her life and death, still spoke of her with a love so undiminished by time that it was almost startling. 50 years later, women in their 60s and 70s cried when they talked about Sister Kathy. They cried the way you cry for someone who was taken from before you were ready, before you had the chance to tell them what they meant to you. She had dreams beyond her immediate teaching role. She was considering continuing her education, pursuing graduate studies. She was 26 years old and had her entire life in front of her, a life that, even within the structure of her religious vows, held enormous possibilities. She was also, by all accounts, someone who could not look away from injustice. Someone who, when she became aware that something was wrong, really wrong, deeply wrong, could not simply pretend she hadn't seen it, and that quality, that inability to look away, may have been what got her killed. To understand the full weight of what Catherine may have on Catherine, and what it may have cost her, you have to understand something about the specific environment of Archbishop Q High School in the late 1960s. The school was, on its surface, exactly what it appeared to be, a respectable Catholic girls' school, staffed by dedicated nuns and teachers, producing graduates who went on to college and careers of quiet purpose. The kind of institution that the Catholic community of Baltimore was genuinely proud of. But beneath that surface, according to what multiple former students would eventually come forward to describe, something terrible was happening. Father Joseph Maskell had positioned himself at the center of the school's spiritual life in a way that gave him extraordinary access to vulnerable young women. His counseling sessions were private. His position gave him the authority to call students out of class, to summon them to his office, to spend time alone with them in spaces that were, by the conventions of the era and the institution, considered appropriate and even sacred. And in those private spaces the abuse occurred. The details that former students eventually disclosed, in therapy, in legal proceedings, in interviews with investigators and journalists, were devastating. Maskell allegedly used his position as confessor and counselor to manipulate students into silence, invoking their faith and their fear of spiritual consequences to ensure that what happened in his office stayed there. He allegedly told girls that their abuse was God's will, that speaking about it would destroy their families, that no one would believe them. He was, by every account, extraordinarily skilled at the particular kind of manipulation that allows abuse to continue in plain sight in an institution full of adults who should have been protecting the children in their care. And some of those former students would later say specifically, and with the grief of people who had carried this knowledge for a long time, that Sister Kathy had found out, that she had learned what was happening, that she had told at least one student that she was going to do something about it, and that very shortly after those conversations, she disappeared. One of the women who would eventually come forward with the most detailed allegations was a former Q student known in legal documents and public reporting by the pseudonym Jane Doe. Later identified after her death as Teresa Lancaster, Teresa had been a student at Q during Maskell's tenure as chaplain. She was one of the girls who had been subjected to his abuse that, according to her eventual testimony, was systematic, repeated, and horrifying in its specifics. Maskell allegedly brought other men into his abuse of students, connecting his victims to other abusers in a network of exploitation that went beyond the school's walls. Teresa Lancaster would eventually, in the 1990s, become one of the central figures in a civil lawsuit against the Archdiocese of Baltimore, a lawsuit that brought many of these allegations into the public record for the first time. And in the course of that lawsuit, she would make a specific claim about Catherine Cesnik. She said that before Catherine disappeared, she had gone to Sister Kathy. She had told her what was happening, and Sister Kathy had believed her without hesitation, had held her, had promised her that she was going to take action. And then Sister Kathy was gone. The implication that Teresa Lancaster and others would carry through decades of grief and legal struggle was that Catherine Cesnik had been silenced. That someone, or multiple people, had decided that a young nun who knew too much and was willing to act on that knowledge was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Whether that implication is provably true, whether the connection between what Catherine knew and what happened to her can be established to the legal standard required for prosecution, is a question that the justice system has never fully answered, but the weight of it has never gone away. Let me take you back to that November evening one more time. It's 1969. The city is cold. The way Baltimore gets cold in early November, not the deep freeze of February, but that particular early winter chill that gets into your bones when you're not quite ready for it yet, when the last warmth of autumn still feels like it should be somewhere nearby. Catherine is in her apartment. She's with Russ, her friend and fellow nun. The apartment is warm, lived in, comfortable. There are probably dishes in the drying rack. There's probably the low sound of the television or the radio. The ordinary textures of a shared domestic life. And Catherine decides to go out. She needs to buy that engagement gift for her sister. It's a practical errand, the kind of thing you don't think twice about. She tells Russ where she's going. She puts on her coat. She takes her keys. She is 26 years old and she is completely, entirely alive, full of plans and thoughts and the particular quiet energy of someone who has been thinking hard about something important. Someone who is on the edge of doing something that takes courage. She walks out the door. The door closes behind her, and that is the last time anyone who loved her will see her alive. What happened between the moment Catherine walked out of her apartment and the moment her body was found in that January field? That is the question that has haunted this case for more than 50 years. The car was found near the Westgate Shopping Center. The engagement gift was inside. She had made it to a store. She had completed that part of her errand. But something happened after that. Something that left her car parked and her gone. Did someone approach her in the parking lot? Did someone she knew pull up alongside her and offer her a ride, or ask her to come somewhere? Did something happen inside the shopping center itself? Investigators in 1969 and 1970 could not definitively answer these questions. The forensic tools available to them were limited compared to what exists today. There were no security cameras blanket covering parking lots. There was no digital trail of phone records and GPS data and credit card transactions that could be reconstructed to Truson's final hours. There were witnesses, or potential witnesses. People who may have been in the area that night. People who may have seen something. But gathering and preserving those accounts in a systematic way was not something that happened effectively in the immediate of Catherine's disappearance. The investigation was hampered, too, by something more than just the limitations of 1969 forensics. It was hampered by what investigators would later come to believe was deliberate obstruction. By the possibility, the troubling, institution-shaking possibility, that the people who knew what had happened to Catherine were people with enough power and enough institutional protection to ensure that the full truth never came out. The Archdiocese of Baltimore. That name will come up again and again in this story, and it's important to understand in the Baltimore of 1969. The Catholic Church was not simply a religious institution in Baltimore. It was a social infrastructure. It ran schools, hospitals, charitable organizations. It employed thousands of people directly and touched the lives of hundreds of thousands more through its parishes and institutions. Its bishops and archbishops were figures of genuine civic authority, People whose opinions were sought by politicians, whose influence extended far beyond the walls of any individual church. In that context, an allegation against a priest, a young, charismatic, well-connected priest who had the support of his superiors, was not simply a personal matter. It was an institutional threat, and institutions, when they feel threatened, do not always respond the way they should. They do not always put the welfare of the vulnerable ahead of the protection of the powerful. History has shown us this, in the Catholic Church and in countless other institutions, with a consistency that is deeply painful to confront. What the Archdiocese of Baltimore knew about Father Maskell in 1969, what they knew, and when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge, is a question that investigators and journalists and survivors have been trying to answer for decades. What is clear is that Maskell continued in ministry for many years after Catherine's death, that he was eventually moved from CUF to other assignments, that allegations against him accumulated over time, that he was eventually laicized, removed from the priesthood, but not until the 1990s, after the civil lawsuit brought his behavior into the public record, and that he died in 2001, before any criminal charges were ever filed against him, without ever having been held legally accountable for what he was accused of doing. By the time Baltimore County investigators came to seriously focus on Maskell as a suspect in Catherine's murder, which would happen in fits and starts over the following decades, with renewed intensity in the 1990s following the civil lawsuit, they were working against enormous obstacles. Time was one obstacle. The evidence from 1969 was fragmentary. Physical evidence had not been preserved with the care that modern forensic standards would demand. Witnesses' memories had faded or been complicated by the passage of years. The original investigation, conducted in an era before many of the tools of modern homicide investigation existed, had left gaps that could not easily be filled. Institutional resistance was another obstacle. The Archdiocese, whatever the private knowledge of its officials, was not an enthusiastic cooperative partner in investigations that threatened to expose the behavior of its priests. The culture of institutional self-protection that has been documented in Catholic dioceses across the United States was not absent in Baltimore. And there was a third obstacle, one that is perhaps the most painful to describe: the victims themselves. The women who had been abused by Maskell, who carried the knowledge of what he had done to them, who understood in their bones what kind of man he was. These women had been systematically taught not to speak. They had been manipulated, threatened, shamed into silence by a man who understood exactly which psychological levers to pull. Coming forward, even decades later, was not simply a matter of deciding to tell the truth. It was a matter of overcoming years of deliberately imposed trauma, of fighting through layers of fear and shame that Maskell had constructed precisely to keep his secrets safe. That any of them came forward at all is a testament to a courage that is hard to fully articulate. Let me tell you about Jean Hargadon Wenner. Jean was another former student at Archbishop Q High School. She was one of the women who, in the 1990s, came forward with allegations of abuse by Father Maskell, and she, like Teresa Lancaster, would make specific and detailed claims, not just about the abuse itself, but about the connection between that abuse and the death of Sister Kathy. Jane's account, which she has shared publicly, including in the Netflix documentary, The Keepers, which brought this case to a massive international audience in 2017, included a claim as among the most disturbing elements of this entire story. She said that Father Maskell, at some point after Catherine's disappearance, took her to a location where a body was present. That he used the presence of that body, Catherine's body, she believed, as a demonstration of what happened to people who spoke. This claim, if true, would mean that Maskell not only knew where Catherine's body was, but used the knowledge of what had happened to her as an instrument of terror against the very girls he was abusing. It would mean that Catherine's death served a specific, calculated purpose in maintaining his control over his victims. John Wenner was challenged on this account. Her memories had surfaced through a process that included therapy and what she described as recovered memory, a controversial area in the psychology of trauma that has been the subject of significant debate. The question of recovered memory, Whether memories of trauma can be genuinely suppressed and then accurately recovered, or whether the therapeutic process can inadvertently create false memories, is one that courts and researchers have wrestled with extensively. These challenges to Jean's account were used by those who sought to discredit the allegations against Maskell, to cast doubt on the entire narrative. But Jan Wenner's account was not the only account. It was not the only thread pointing in the same direction, and the pattern of behavior it described, a predatory priest using his position and his knowledge to terrorize his victims into silence, was entirely consistent with what multiple other women described independently. The civil lawsuit filed in the 1990s, brought by Teresa Lancaster and another survivor, was ultimately dismissed on statute of limitations grounds. The survivors had waited too long, the court ruled, for the legal clock to allow their claims to proceed. It was a ruling that felt, to the survivors and to many who had followed the case, like a second betrayal. The first betrayal had been the abuse itself, the systematic exploitation of vulnerable young women by a man entrusted with their spiritual care. The second betrayal was the legal system's determination that the time allowed for seeking justice had simply run out. But the lawsuit, even though it was dismissed, had accomplished something irreversible. It had brought the allegations into the public record. It had attached names and specifics to what had previously been rumors and whispers. It had forced the Archdiocese of Baltimore to respond, publicly, to questions it would clearly have preferred not to answer. And it had reignited public and investigative interest in the question of what had happened to Sister Kathy. In the years following the lawsuit, investigators made several attempts to build a criminal case related to Catherine's murder. They interviewed survivors. They re-examined the physical evidence from 1969. They looked at Maskell's history, his movements, his connections. They were never able to bring charges. Maskell died in 2001. He was 61 years old. He had spent his final years out of the public eye. His priesthood taken from him. The allegations against him extensively documented but never adjudicated in a criminal court. His death did not close the case. Officially, the murder of Catherine Cesnik remains unsolved. But it did foreclose one avenue, the possibility of seeing the man many believed responsible face justice in a courtroom, answer for what he had done, be held accountable in the way that the law is supposed to hold the guilty accountable. That door closed in 2001, and Catherine's family and her former students, and the survivors of Maskell's abuse were left with something that is very hard to live with, the knowledge, or near knowledge, of what happened, without the formal acknowledgement that the justice system represents. There is one more thread in this story that I want to follow, before deeper into the investigation itself. Father Maskell did not act alone, or at least, the allegations against him suggest strongly that he did not act alone. Multiple survivors describe being brought into contact with other abusers through Maskell, men who were not priests, men from outside the school, men whose identities were sometimes known and sometimes not. The abuse that survivors described was not simply the opportunistic predation of one isolated man. It had, in their accounts, a networked quality, a sense that Maskell was connected to a broader circle of men who shared his proclivities and his willingness to exploit vulnerable young women. One name that appeared in some survivor accounts was that of another priest, Father Neil Magnus. Though the details of his alleged involvement and the extent of any cooperation between the two men were never fully established in legal proceedings, there were also references, in some accounts, to law enforcement figures, suggestions that Maskell's ability to operate with such apparent impunity was connected to relationships he had cultivated with people in positions of authority, people who might have been inclined to look away or actively intervene to protect him. Whether those suggestions accurately describe a genuine network of protection, or whether they reflect the survivors' understandable attempts to explain how such sustained abuse could have continued undetected and unpunished, is a question that has never been definitively answered. What is clear is that Maskell operated for years in a role that gave him direct access to children, that multiple women were abused over an extended period, and that the institutional structures that should have protected those women failed them catastrophically. And in the middle of all of it, In the middle of the abuse and the silence and the institutional protection was a young woman with a guitar in a classroom full of girls she loved, who found out something she couldn't unknow. 26 years old, walking out of her apartment on a November evening to buy an engagement gift for her sister. And somewhere in that cold Baltimore night, something happened that ended her life and began a mystery that has now stretched across more than 5 decades. In the next part of our story, we're going to follow the investigation. The original investigation in 1969-1970, the renewed efforts in the 1990s, the forensic examination of Maskell's remains in 2017, and the ongoing efforts by law enforcement and by the extraordinary group of former students who have spent years refusing to let Sister Kathy's story be forgotten. We're going to look at the evidence. We're going to look at the suspects. We're going to look at the twists and turns and dead ends that have made this one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. But right now, we're going to pause here, because you need to sit with Catherine for a moment. The woman she was, the life she had, the courage she showed, before we follow her into the darkness. The morning of January 3, 1970 was gray and cold in the way that early January mornings in Maryland tend to be, the kind of cold that feels permanent, that makes you forget summer ever existed. That settles into the landscape like it belongs there. A young boy was moving through a field off Joe Avenue in the Lansdowne area of Baltimore County. It was the kind of field that collects the debris of a city at its edges, trash, discarded things, the accumulated refuse of a neighborhood that backs up against empty land. Not the kind of place anyone goes deliberately, the kind of place you pass through, or stumble into, or explore because you are young and fields are interesting and no one has told you not to. He wasn't looking for anything, and then he found something. The body of Catherine Cesnik had been lying in that field for weeks, exposed to the elements of a Maryland winter, partially concealed by the trash and overgrowth that surrounded her. She was dressed in the clothes she had worn on the night she disappeared, November 7th, nearly 2 months earlier. Her coat, her shoes. The ordinary clothing of a young woman who had stepped out to run an errand and expected to be home within the hour. The boy ran, and within a short time, the field off Joe Avenue became a crime scene. Baltimore County Police and Baltimore City Police both had stakes in what happened next. The missing persons case had been a city matter. The body had been found in the county. Jurisdictional coordination in 1969 and 1970 was not the seamless, protocol-driven process that modern law enforcement agencies have developed over decades of refinement. There were questions about who was in charge, about how evidence would be processed, about how the two agencies would share information and resources. These questions mattered. They mattered practically, because the decisions made in the first hours and days of a homicide investigation can determine whether the case is ever solved. The way a scene is processed, the way evidence is collected and preserved, the way witnesses are identified and interviewed, all of these things have downstream consequences that can persist for decades. And in the case of Catherine Cesnik, some of those early decisions, or failures to decide, failures to act, failures to preserve, would haunt the investigation for years. The medical examiner examined Catherine's remains. The exposure to winter conditions for nearly 2 months complicated the analysis significantly. Determining the precise cause of death required careful examination of what the elements had left intact. What the medical examiner ultimately concluded was that Catherine had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, a severe impact that had caused a fatal injury. The nature of the object that had caused that injury could not be definitively identified from what remained. The time of death, always a critical element in a homicide investigation, could not be precisely established. She had been out there for a long time. The best the medical examiner could say was that her death had likely occurred around the time of her disappearance in early November. But the precision that modern forensics can sometimes achieve was simply not available given the condition of the remains. What this meant, practically, was that investigators were working with a body that told them a great deal about the fact of Catherine's death, but relatively little about its specific circumstances. They knew she had been struck. They knew she had ended up in a field in Lansdowne. They knew the approximate time frame. They did not know who had done it. They did not know where she had been killed. They did not know how she had gotten from wherever the crime occurred to the field where she was found. The discovery of Catherine's body sent a wave of grief through the Baltimore Catholic community that is hard to fully describe. Her students at Archbishop Q, the girls who had loved her, who had hoped and prayed for her safe return through those 2 months of searching, were devastated in the deep, foundational way that young people are devastated when the world reveals itself to be more dangerous and more cruel than they had understood. Many of them were teenagers, in the years when the ground under your sense of safety is still being laid, and the news that Sister Kathy was gone, not just missing, but gone, fractured something in them that did not easily heal. Her family in Pittsburgh received the news that no family wants to receive. Her parents, who had raised her, who had watched her choose her vocation with such conviction and live it with such wholeness. They lost their daughter in that January cold. The religious community of the School Sisters of Notre Dame mourned one of their own, a woman who had embodied, in her warmth and her commitment and her courage, exactly the values their order was built around. And at the school, in the halls where Catherine had taught and laughed and listened and directed plays and changed lives, there was a grief that was tangled up with fear, because someone had killed Sister Kathy. Someone, somewhere had decided that she needed to die. And in a close-knit community like the one surrounding Q, the question of who and why was not an abstract one. Some people already had suspicions. Some people already knew things they were not saying. Let's talk about the investigation as it actually unfolded in those early months of 1970, because understanding its limitations is essential to understanding why this case remained unsolved for so long. The Baltimore County Police Department took the lead on the homicide investigation, given that the body had been found in the county. They conducted interviews. They looked at people connected to Catherine, her fellow nuns, colleagues at the school, people from her personal life, anyone who might have had contact with her on or around the night of November 7th. Father Maskill was interviewed. He said he didn't know anything about what had happened to Sister Kathy. He expressed what investigators described as appropriate grief and concern. He cooperated on the surface with the investigation. He had an alibi for the relevant time period, or at least, he provided an account of his whereabouts that investigators did not immediately find reason to disbelieve, and the investigation, lacking a clear evidentiary path forward, did not at that point center on Maskill. This is important to understand. In 1970, the allegations of abuse that would eventually surface, the accounts from former students about what Maskill had done to them, about the network of exploitation he had constructed within the school, none of that was on the record. None of it was known to investigators as a context for the crime. The women who had been abused were not coming forward. They had been too thoroughly conditioned to silence by the very man investigators were talking to. So investigators were looking at a young nun's murder without the crucial piece of information that would eventually come to define how the case was understood, the possibility that she had been killed because she knew about systematic child sexual abuse and was about to expose it. Without that context, the investigation was working in a relative vacuum. A young woman had disappeared and been found dead. There was no obvious crime scene. There was no clear physical evidence pointing to a suspect. There were no witnesses who came forward with compelling information. The case went cold. Not immediately, investigators continued to work it, continued to follow leads as they arose. But as the months passed and the leads dried up, the active investigation slowed to a near halt. Catherine's file remained open, but it was not a case that was generating new evidence or producing new leads on any regular basis. For years, for most of the 1970s and into the 1980s, the murder of Catherine Cesnik was an unsolved case that received periodic attention but no resolution. Meanwhile, at Archbishop High School, Father Joseph Maskill continued his work. He continued counseling students. He continued hearing confessions. He continued using the access and authority his position gave him to exploit vulnerable young women. The abuse that had allegedly been occurring before Catherine's disappearance did not stop with her death. If anything, her death, and the silence that surrounded it may have reinforced his sense of impunity. He was, by all accounts, good at his job in the ways that were visible. He was liked by parents. He was respected by school administration. He was seen as a committed, engaged chaplain who took the spiritual welfare of his students seriously. The surface presentation was effective enough that the reality underneath it remained hidden. At some point in the 1970s, Maskell was moved from Kew to other assignments within the Archdiocese. The precise timing and reasons for this transition have been a subject of scrutiny. Some investigators and journalists have suggested that the move reflected the Archdiocese's awareness of problems with Maskell, an awareness that led them to transfer him rather than confront what he was doing. The Archdiocese has disputed characterizations of the transfer as an attempt to cover up or manage allegations of abuse. What is clear is that Maskell continued an active ministry after leaving Kew. He continued to have access to young people, and the abuse, according to survivors from multiple assignments, continued. The 1980s brought no resolution to Catherine's case and no public accountability for Maskell. But something was happening beneath the surface during those years, something that would eventually break open in ways no one could contain. The women who had been abused by Maskell were carrying what had been done to them. They were living their lives, marrying, having children, building careers, going to therapy, finding ways to function, but they were carrying it. The trauma of what they had experienced, the silence they had been forced into, the way their faith and their youth had been weaponized against them, these things don't simply dissolve with time. They transform. They find their way into other areas of life. They shape the way a person relates to trust, to authority, to their own sense of worth and safety. Some of the women had begun, through the process of therapy, to confront what had happened to them. In the context of those therapeutic relationships, memories and experiences that had been buried or compartmentalized began to surface. For some women, this process was gradual. For others, it was more sudden, a recognition, sometimes triggered by something external, that what had been done to them had a name, and that they were not alone in having experienced it. The late 1980s and early 1990s saw a broader cultural shift in the United States around the recognition of childhood sexual abuse, a shift driven in part by survivors speaking out, in part by growing research in psychology and trauma, in part by legal and journalistic attention to the ways institutions had failed to protect children. This shift created, for the first time in many cases, a context in which survivors felt it might be possible to come forward, that they might be believed, that there might be consequences for their abusers. It was in this context that Teresa Lancaster and other survivors of Maskell's abuse began to take steps toward disclosure. The process was not simple and it was not quick. Teresa Lancaster had been living with what Maskell had done to her for more than 2 decades. The memories, the shame, the fear, these had been her companions for years. Coming forward meant not only speaking publicly about deeply personal trauma, but doing so in a context where she could expect to be challenged, disbelieved, and attacked. The institutional power of the Catholic Church was not a small thing to confront. The reputation of a priest against the word of a woman, who had been a teenager when the abuse occurred. This was not a fight that history suggested was easy to win. But Teresa came forward, and she was not alone. Other women, survivors of Maskell's abuse, women who had attended Kew during his tenure, began to speak to each other, to therapists, and eventually to attorneys about what they had experienced. A picture emerged that was consistent across multiple accounts: a chaplain who had systematically abused students over a period of years, who had used the confessional and the counseling relationship as instruments of exploitation, and who had connections that extended beyond the school walls into a broader network of abuse. In the early 1990s, a civil lawsuit was filed against the Archdiocese of Baltimore and against Maskell personally. The lawsuit alleged this had known about Maskell's behavior, or should have known, and had failed to protect students by removing him from contact with minors. The filing of that lawsuit changed everything. Not immediately and not in the way the survivors had hoped. The lawsuit would ultimately be dismissed without a verdict on the merits. But the act of filing it, of putting the allegations into the public record, of forcing the archdiocese to respond publicly to specific claims from named plaintiffs. This was irreversible, and it brought Catherine Cesnik's name back into public conversation in a new and urgent way. Because the lawsuit didn't just allege abuse, it alleged a connection between that abuse and murder. The survivors, Teresa Lancaster and John Hargadon Wenner most prominently, made specific claims about Catherine. That she had known about the abuse, that she had promised to act on what she knew, and that her death was connected to that knowledge. John Wenner's account was particularly detailed and particularly disturbing. She described Maskell bringing her to a location where she saw a body she identified as Catherine, as a form of warning, a demonstration that speaking had consequences, a threat delivered in the most visceral way imaginable. If Jean's account was accurate, it meant that Maskell had not simply killed Catherine, or arranged for her to be killed. It meant he had used her death as a tool, had brought a vulnerable teenager to look at the body of a murdered woman and told her, in effect, that this was what happened to people who talked. The horror of that, the calculated, cold-blooded horror of it, is almost difficult to hold in your mind. When this account became public through the lawsuit and through subsequent journalism, it electrified the case. It gave investigators a new frame for understanding Catherine's murder, and it put Maskell, who had been interviewed and released without charge in 1970, squarely in the center of the investigation again. Baltimore County investigators reopened their examination of the case. They interviewed Maskell again. He continued to deny any involvement in Catherine's death. He denied knowing where she had been taken, denied having shown anyone her body, denied any connection to her murder. Investigators were skeptical. The pattern of behavior described by survivors, the manipulation, the threats, the use of institutional authority to silence victims, was entirely consistent with someone capable of a premeditated killing to protect a secret. The motive was clear. Catherine had known about the abuse and had been preparing to expose it. The means were not beyond a man with Maskell's connections, and his apparent willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect himself. But motive and consistency are not evidence, and the physical evidence connecting Maskell to Catherine's murder was not sufficient to support charges. The investigation looked carefully at the timeline. Catherine had disappeared on November 7th. Her body was found January 3rd. Where had she been in the intervening weeks? Had she been killed immediately on the night she disappeared, and the body hidden before being moved to the Lansdowne field? Or had something else happened? Had she been held somewhere? Or had the body been moved multiple times? These questions could not be definitively answered from the available evidence. Investigators also looked at the location where the body was found. The field off Jaw Avenue was not random. It was a specific place in a specific part of Baltimore County. Understanding why Catherine's body had ended up there required understanding who knew that area, who had reason to go there, who might have chosen it as a disposal site. Some investigators developed theories. Some of those theories pointed toward Maskell, or toward people connected to him. But theories, again, are not evidence. There was another name that surfaced in connection with this case, a name that added another layer of complexity to an already complicated story. Edgar Davidson. Davidson was a convicted sex offender who had a history in the Baltimore area. His name came up in some accounts as a possible additional suspect, or as someone connected to the broader network of abuse that survivors described. Investigators looked at him as a possible participant in Catherine's murder. He died before investigators could pursue him as fully as they might have wished. The appearance of Davidson's name in the investigation illustrated something important about the way this case had developed, the way it had accumulated possible suspects and possible connections over decades, each new thread adding complexity without necessarily adding resolution. The more investigators looked, the more the case seemed to expand rather than narrow, the circle of possible involvement growing rather than shrinking to a single, clearly identifiable perpetrator. This is not unusual in cases involving institutional abuse. The secrecy that surrounds such abuse, the number of people who may have known or suspected something without speaking, the way institutional protection operates to diffuse and obscure responsibility, All of these factors make the investigative process enormously difficult. You are not looking for a single bad actor operating in isolation. You are looking at a system designed to protect itself, and trying to identify specific acts of criminal responsibility within that system. Father Maskell was aware throughout the 1990s that investigators were looking at him seriously for Catherine's murder. He had been laicized by the mid-1990s, removed from the priesthood following the civil lawsuit and the public attention it brought. He was no longer Father Maskell in any official sense. He was Joseph Maskell, a private citizen living in the Baltimore area, stripped of the clerical authority that had been the instrument of it charged. Not with the abuse. Not with the murder. He gave interviews in which he denied everything. He maintained his innocence with a consistency that his defenders cited as evidence of that innocence, and that survivors and investigators interpreted as the practiced performance of a man who had been controlling narratives for decades. He sought in various ways to discredit the survivors who had come forward to challenge their memories, to question their motivations, to portray himself as the victim of false allegations by troubled women. This is a pattern that will be familiar to anyone who has followed cases involving institutional abuse. The survivor who comes forward is challenged not just on the specific facts of their account, but on their credibility, their mental stability, their possible motives. The powerful institution and its representatives deploy the full weight of their resources, legal, reputational, rhetorical, against the individuals who dare to speak. It is a profoundly unequal fight, and the survivors of Maskell's abuse fought it anyway. The question of recovered memory deserves more attention here, because it became one of the central battlegrounds in this case, and because understanding it matters for evaluating the evidence. Jane Hargadon Wenner's account of being shown Catherine's body surfaced through a therapeutic process in which she worked with a therapist to address the trauma of her abuse. The memories came back in pieces through a process that Jean described as gradual and at times overwhelming, not a sudden, complete recollection but a slow, painful reassembly of experiences that she had apparently dissociated from. The science of recovered memory is genuinely complicated. There is substantial evidence that trauma can interfere with normal memory formation and retrieval, that experiences of extreme fear and violation can be encoded in ways that make them difficult to access through ordinary recall, but that can be triggered or reconstructed through therapeutic work. Dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism in which the mind essentially detaches from an overwhelming experience, is a well-documented response to severe trauma. At the same time, research on memory has consistently shown that human memory is not like a video recording. It is reconstructive, subject to the influence of suggestion, capable of incorporating details that seem real but may be confabulated. The therapeutic process itself, if not conducted carefully, can inadvertently shape the way memories are recalled. This is not a simple he said, she said between believing survivors and skeptically scrutinizing their accounts. It is a genuine scientific and legal complexity that courts and researchers have grappled with extensively. In the context of the Maskell case, the challenge of recovered memory was used aggressively by the defense to attack the credibility of survivors' accounts. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed in part on these grounds. The court found that the statute of limitations had run, and the question of whether the survivor's memory recovery provided legal justification for tolling that limitations period was resolved against the plaintiffs. But dismissal on statute of limitations grounds is not a finding that the abuse didn't happen. It is not a determination that the survivors' accounts were false. It is a procedural ruling about timing. The women who came forward were not lying. Multiple women independently described the same abuser, the same patterns of behavior, the same methods of control. The consistency of their accounts, the way they corroborated each other on details that they had no opportunity to coordinate, was itself a form of evidence, even if it was not evidence admissible in the specific legal proceeding they had brought. Let me take you back to the investigation itself for a moment. In the years following the civil lawsuit, Baltimore County investigators made several significant efforts to build a criminal case around Catherine's murder. One of the most important involved a thorough re-examination of the physical evidence from the original case. Investigators went back through that had been collected in 1969 and 1970. The evidence from the scene where Catherine's body was found, any forensic material that had been preserved, documentation from the original investigation. What they found was a mixed picture. Some evidence had been preserved in ways that made it potentially useful even decades later. Other evidence had been lost, degraded, or simply never collected properly in the first place. There were specific items, specific pieces of physical evidence, that investigators believed might, with modern forensic techniques, yield information about who had handled Catherine or where she had been. DNA analysis, which had not existed as an investigative tool in 1970, offered the possibility of extracting biological information from samples that might still retain usable genetic material. Investigators worked with forensic experts to see what could be recovered. The process was painstaking and not always productive. The degradation of biological material over decades poses enormous challenges even to modern forensic science. But the effort itself was significant. It represented a commitment to pursuing justice for Catherine even across the enormous gap of time that separated the original crime from the renewed investigation. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, a group of former Q students took it upon themselves to conduct their own informal investigation into Catherine's murder. These were women who had known her, who had been in her classes, had performed in her plays, had been touched by her warmth and her care. Women who had grown up and built their own lives, but who had never stopped thinking about Sister Kathy, who had never been able to accept the fact that she had been murdered, and that no one had been held accountable. Gemma Hoskins and Abby Fitzgerald Schaub would become the most prominent of these unofficial investigators, ordinary women, not trained detectives, not lawyers, not journalists, but women driven by love for a teacher they had lost and by a fierce, unquenchable conviction that the truth deserved to be told. They gathered documents. They interviewed anyone who would talk to them. They dug into Maskell's history, his assignments, his connections. They built a picture of his behavior over decades, tracking the institutions he had moved through, looking for patterns, looking for evidence. They worked largely without official support, and sometimes in the face of active official indifference. Their efforts were not always welcomed by law enforcement agencies that were conducting their own investigations and were not necessarily eager to coordinate with civilians. They operated in the gaps left by official investigation, following threads that the police had not followed or had followed insufficiently, and they refused to stop. Their persistence, and the persistence of the survivors who had come forward, would eventually contribute to the renewed attention this case received when a documentary about it was produced in the 2010s. Father Maskell died on May 2, 2001. He was 61 years old. He died of natural causes, a heart attack, in a care facility in the Baltimore area. He had been living quietly, removed from ministry, out of the public eye for most of his final years. He died without having been charged with Catherine's murder. He died without having been criminally prosecuted for the abuse of the women who had come forward. He died, in the formal legal sense, as an innocent man, never convicted of anything, never required to answer in a courtroom for what survivors said he had done. For the women who had survived his abuse, for the community that had lost Sister Kathy, for the people who had spent years trying to hold him accountable, his death was a specific kind of devastation. Not grief for the man himself, not that, but grief for the accountability that his death foreclosed. The chance to see him answer for what he had done, in public under oath, with the full weight of legal consequence. That chance was gone. Investigations into Catherine's murder continued after Maskell's death. His death did not automatically mean that the case was closed. There remained the possibility that others had been involved, that the network of abuse and protection that survivors described extended beyond Maskell to include other individuals who might still be alive and reachable. And there remained the possibility, however remote, that forensic science would eventually yield evidence that could point definitively in a direction that all the circumstantial evidence had already indicated. A Netflix documentary called The Keepers, brought Catherine's story to an audience of millions. Directed by Ryan White, the documentary followed Gemma Hoskins and Abby Fitzgerald Schaub in their investigation. It interviewed survivors of Maskell's abuse, including John Hargadon Wenner and others who had not previously told their stories publicly. It examined the evidence against Maskell, the institutional response of the Archdiocese, and the decades of official investigation that had not produced charges. The documentary was not a neutral presentation. It had a clear perspective that Maskell had killed Catherine, or had been responsible for her death, and that institutional forces had conspired to prevent justice. It made its case through the accumulated testimony of survivors, the reconstruction of the investigation's history, and the careful examination of evidence and motive. The response to The Keepers was enormous. It became one of Netflix's most watched documentary series of 2017. It generated widespread public discussion about the case, about institutional abuse in the Catholic Church, and about the way the legal system had failed the survivors. It won awards. It was credited with inspiring new investigations and new attention to the case from law enforcement agencies that had not been actively working it. For Gemma Hoskins and Abby Fitzgerald Schaub, and for the survivors who had shared their stories on camera, the documentary represented a kind of validation, a public acknowledgement of truths that had been fought over and dismissed and minimized for decades. And it prompted a specific, concrete investigative action that became one of the most significant developments in the case since the discovery of Catherine's body in 1970. Following the release of The Keepers, the Baltimore County Police Department, with renewed public attention on the pressure to demonstrate that justice was being pursued, announced that they were reopening the investigation into Catherine's murder. Part of that renewed investigation involved something that had not been possible before: the forensic examination of Father Maskell's remains. Maskell had died in 2001 and had been buried. Investigators now exhumed his remains in order to extract DNA, with the goal of potentially comparing that DNA to any biological evidence that had been recovered from the original crime scene or from Catherine's remains. The exhumation was carried out, the forensic examination was conducted, and the results were complicated. The DNA extracted from Maskell's remains was compared against available evidence from the case. The analysis did not produce a definitive match connecting Maskell biologically to the crime scene. It did not produce the smoking gun forensic result that investigators had hoped might finally close the case. This did not mean that Maskell was innocent. Absence of a DNA match does not establish innocence, particularly in a case where the original evidence collection was limited, where decades of degradation had compromised biological material, and where the specific way a crime was committed might not have left the kinds of biological evidence that DNA analysis can detect. But it did mean that the forensic path forward was not as clear as investigators had hoped. The Archdiocese of Baltimore, in the years following The Keepers, and the renewed public attention on the case, took steps that represented, for some survivors, a partial and insufficient reckoning with what had happened. The Archdiocese acknowledged that Maskell had abused students. It expressed regret. It pointed to the steps it had taken to address clergy sexual abuse more broadly, the protocols and policies put in place in the aftermath of the larger national reckoning with abuse in the Catholic Church, and had begun with the Boston Globe's reporting in 2002. For some survivors and for Catherine's supporters, these acknowledgments felt inadequate. They felt like the minimum possible response, an acknowledgment of the obvious, stripped of the full accounting of who knew what and when, of what decisions were made to protect Maskell at the expense of his victims, of what role, if any, institutional actors had played in the events surrounding Catherine's death. The full truth of what the Archdiocese knew and when, and what they did with that knowledge, has never been publicly established to anyone's complete satisfaction. One of the most haunting aspects of this case, one of the things that makes it genuinely different from many other unsolved murders, is the community that has formed around the pursuit of justice for Catherine. The former students of Archbishop Q High School, who have driven so much of the unofficial investigation into this case, are not motivated by professional obligation or financial incentive. They are motivated by love. by memory, by the specific, aching grief of people who lost someone who mattered to them, who were failed by the institutions that should have protected both them and her, and who have refused, across 50 years, to simply accept that failure. Gemma Hoskins and Abby Fitzgerald Schaub spent years of their lives on this investigation. They built a Facebook group, a space where former Q students and others connected to the case could share information, compare memories, and support each other, that grew to tens of thousands of members. They traveled to interviews. They filed public records requests. They attended court proceedings. They kept the pressure on. They did all of this without being paid, without being trained investigators, without the resources or authority of law enforcement. They did it because Sister Kathy had mattered to them, because the girls she had tried to protect had mattered to her, because the truth, even when it is terrible, deserves to be known. Jean Hargadon Wenner, whose account of being shown Catherine's body became one of the most discussed elements of The Keepers, has continued to speak publicly about her experiences in the years since the documentary's release. Her courage in doing so is not a small thing. She has been attacked. She has been called a liar. She has had her memories questioned by people with professional and institutional interests in discrediting her. She has lived for decades with the weight of what was done to her, and with the additional burden of speaking publicly about it in a context where powerful forces had strong incentives to make sure she wasn't believed. She has spoken because she believes it matters, because she believes that Catherine's story, and the stories of all the other women who were abused, deserve to be part of the permanent public record, because silence, she has said, is what allowed all of this to happen in the first place. Teresa Lancaster, who was the other primary survivor in the 1990 civil lawsuit, died in 2015. Before The Keepers was released, before she could see the massive public response to the story she had fought so hard to tell. Her death was mourned by everyone who had been part of this decades-long effort. She had carried so much for so long, and she had done it with a dignity and a persistence that inspired everyone around her. She never got to see the documentary. She never got to see the public acknowledgement that her account deserved. She died before the world finally listened in the way that she had deserved for it to listen. That is its own injustice, quiet, personal, devastating. The investigation into Catherine's murder remained technically open as of the time of the documentary, and in the years that followed, Baltimore County Police periodically reaffirmed their commitment to pursuing the case. Cold case investigators continued to review the evidence when new information surfaced or new forensic possibilities emerged. The case was not forgotten, could not be forgotten. Given the sustained public attention it had received and the ongoing advocacy of the community that had formed around it. But as of the writing of this account, no charges have been filed. No one is being held legally accountable for the death of Catherine Cesnik. Maskell is dead. Edgar Davidson is dead. The other figures who appeared in various accounts as potentially connected to the crime are aging, and some have died as well. The window of possibility for criminal prosecution, never wide, given the limitations of the original investigation, has been narrowing with each passing year. What does it mean for a case to be unsolved? In one sense, the answer is purely technical. It means that no one has been charged and convicted in connection with the crime. The legal machinery of accountability has not produced its intended output. But in another sense, cases like Catherine's are not fully unsolved. The community of people who have investigated, documented, and told this story, the survivors, the former students, the journalists, the documentary filmmakers, have built an accounting of what happened that is, in its essentials, clear. A young nun who taught at Archbishop Q High School learned that the school's chaplain was systematically abusing students. She took steps to expose that abuse. She disappeared and was murdered. The man most credibly suspected of responsibility for that murder, or for arranging it, was a priest who spent decades protected by institutional structures that prioritized his continued ministry over the safety of the children in his care, and the life of the woman who tried to protect them. That is not a legal finding. It is not a verdict. It is an accounting built from testimony and evidence and the patient, loving labor of people who refuse to let the truth be buried. It is what Catherine Cesnik deserves, and it is not yet enough. In the next chunk, we are going to go deeper into the specific evidence, the forensic details, the witness testimonies, the contradictions and inconsistencies that have defined the investigative history of this case. We are going to look at what investigators found and what they couldn't find, at the alibis that didn't quite hold together, at the phone records and the timelines and the geography of a November night in Baltimore. We are going to follow the detectives who worked this case and the obstacles they faced. And we are going to look at the specific moments when the investigation came closest to breaking open, and what prevented it from doing so. Because the story of Catherine Cesnik is not just the story of a murder. It is the story of everything that stood between that murder and justice. And that story is not finished yet. Let's go back to the evidence. Because in a case like this, a case that has been argued over and investigated and documented across more than 5 decades, it is easy to get lost in the broader narrative. In the institutional failures, the survivor accounts, the documentary coverage, all of that matters. All of that is part of the story. But at the center of everything is a crime. A specific crime committed on or around a specific night against a specific woman, and understanding that crime. Understanding what the physical evidence actually showed, what the witnesses actually said, what the timeline actually looked like when you laid it out carefully, is essential to understanding both how close investigators came to solving it and why, despite everything, it remains officially unsolved. So let's start with the scene. The field off Joe Avenue in Lansdowne, Baltimore County, when investigators arrived on January 3, 1970, following the young boy's discovery of Catherine's remains. They were confronted with a scene that presented immediate and significant challenges. The body had been exposed to the elements for approximately 2 months. Baltimore winters are not the extreme cold of northern states, but they are cold enough, freezing temperatures, precipitation, wind, to do considerable damage to an unprotected body over an 8-week period. The field itself was not a sealed environment. It was open land accessible to animals, to weather, to anyone who might have passed through. What this meant practically was that the scene, by the time investigators reached it, had been significantly compromised by time and exposure. Any biological evidence, blood, hair, fiber, fluid, that might have been present at the point of initial deposition had been affected by weeks of winter weather. Any trace evidence connecting a specific individual to the body or the immediate surroundings had been degraded or destroyed. This is not unusual in cases where a body is discovered long after death. It is one of the reasons why the timely discovery of a crime scene is so critical to investigation. Every hour that passes is an hour in which evidence degrades, in which the scene changes, in which the forensic story becomes harder to read. In Catherine's case, that degradation had proceeded for 63 days before the body was found. Investigators documented the scene carefully. They photographed. They collected what physical evidence remained. They noted the specific location, its relationship to nearby roads, nearby structures, nearby landmarks that might help establish why it had been chosen as a disposal site. The field was not prominently visible from major roads. It was the kind of place you would know about if you were familiar with the area, not a spot that a stranger would stumble upon easily as a disposal site. This suggested to investigators that whoever had left Catherine there had either known the area or had been guided by someone who did. The proximity to certain roads allowed investigators to think about how a body might have been transported there. A vehicle could have approached from multiple directions. The field was accessible by car to someone who knew the approach. It was not a location that required significant physical effort to reach. You could drive close enough that carrying a body any distance would not have been necessary. These details, the accessibility, the relative obscurity, the sense that the location was known rather than randomly chosen, fed investigators suspicion that the perpetrator had local knowledge. That this was not a stranger crime. Not a random act by someone with no connection to Baltimore's southwestern neighborhoods and surrounding county. The medical examiner's findings, when they were documented and released, told investigators what they could about the cause of death, while being honest about the limitations imposed by the condition of the remains. Blunt force trauma to the head. That was the conclusion. Catherine had been struck, and struck with sufficient force to cause fatal injury. The nature of the wound was consistent with a deliberate attack, rather than an accident or fall. What the medical examiner could not establish with certainty was the exact instrument used. The degradation of the remains over 2 months meant that the wound characteristics that might have allowed a more specific identification. The precise shape and size of a depression fracture, the pattern left by a specific type of object, were not fully preserved. What investigators needed was a weapon. Something that could be matched to the wound characteristics. Something that could be connected to a suspect. They did not find one. The time of death question was similarly complicated. Based on the condition of the remains and the known environmental conditions of the preceding 2 months, the medical examiner estimated that death had most likely occurred around the time of Catherine's disappearance, that she had been killed on or shortly after the night of November 7, 1969. Rather than being held alive for any significant period before her death. This was important. It meant that whatever happened to Catherine happened quickly, that she had not been abducted and held somewhere for days or weeks before being killed. The crime had most likely committed within hours of her leaving her apartment, the engagement gift inside the car. This detail deserves careful attention, because it is one of the most specific and telling pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. Catherine had gone out to buy a gift for her sister. The gift was found inside her car, which was discovered near the Westgate shopping center. This means that Catherine had successfully completed at least part of her errand. She had gone to a store, she had purchased the gift, she had returned to her car with it. The fact that the gift was inside the car rather than on her person suggests that she had returned to the car after making her purchase. She had put the gift in the car. At that point, her plan would have been to drive home to the apartment on Westgate Avenue, a journey of only a few minutes. Something happened between putting the gift in the car and driving away. Did someone approach her in the parking lot? Did she see someone she recognized? Someone whose presence there she had no reason to be suspicious of? Did someone knock on her car window? Did someone she trusted ask her to come with them, to go somewhere briefly, with an explanation that seemed reasonable at the time? Or did something happen before she reached her car, while she was still in the shopping center, or on her way back through the parking lot? The car itself yielded no clear forensic answers to these questions. The gift was inside. The car was parked. There were no signs of a struggle within the vehicle that investigators documented in their reports. Whatever happened to Catherine after she put that gift in her car? It did not appear to have happened inside the vehicle. This raises a question that investigators wrestled with from the beginning. Did Catherine leave with someone voluntarily? A forced abduction from a parking lot, particularly in 1969, when shopping center parking lots were not the heavily monitored, camera-covered environments they are today, was not impossible. But a forced abduction leaves evidence. Witnesses notice a struggle. Sounds attract attention. A woman being physically forced into a vehicle is something people tend to remember. No credible witnesses came forward to describe seeing anything like that, which suggests, though does not prove, that Catherine made into another vehicle willingly. That she may have encountered someone she knew and trusted, someone whose request that she come with them, or go somewhere did not raise alarm bells in the way that an approach from a stranger would have. This is consistent with the theory that her killer was someone known to her. Someone whose presence in or near the shopping center that evening would not have struck her as threatening. Someone who could have made a request. Can I talk to you for a minute? Can you come somewhere with me? That she would have had no reason to refuse. Father Maskell was someone Catherine knew. Someone whose request for a private conversation she would not have found unusual. Someone whose authority and position in the community she moved through would have made her inclined to extend trust. This is circumstantial reasoning. It is not evidence. But it is the kind of reasoning that shapes the direction of an investigation. The process by which investigators narrow their focus from the vast universe of possible perpetrators to the specific individuals whose relationship to the victim and the circumstances of the crime makes them most worth examining carefully. Let's talk about the witness testimonies, what they established and where they fell short. Investigators in 1969 and 1970 canvassed the area around the Westgate Shopping Center and the Westgate Avenue apartment complex. They spoke to neighbors, to shoppers who had been in the area that evening, to anyone who might have seen Catherine or her car on the night of November 7th. What they gathered was fragmentary. Several witnesses recalled seeing Catherine's car in the shopping center area that evening, consistent with the known fact of her errand. No witnesses reported seeing anything alarming, no confrontation, no visible distress, nothing that would have stood out to someone watching. One of the challenges of canvassing after the fact, particularly after a significant time has elapsed between the event and the investigation, is that human memory is not a reliable recorder of ordinary moments. People who were in a parking lot on a November evening in 1969, going about their own business, had no reason to pay close attention to what was happening around them. The details that might have been useful, the other cars in the lot, the people moving between stores and vehicles, the timing of various comings and goings, were not things that casual observers had encoded in memory with any precision. Investigators spoke to people connected to the school. Teachers, administrators, students, parents, anyone whose relationship to Catherine might have given them relevant knowledge. These interviews were conducted in an environment where, unknown to investigators, a significant number of the people connected to the school had specific reasons to be cautious about what they said. The culture of silence that Maskell had cultivated extended beyond his direct victims to encompass a broader community that had been shaped by his presence and his authority. Whether any of those interviewed in 1969 and 1970 were deliberately withholding information that would have advanced the investigation, whether there were people who knew something and chose not to say so, is something that the passage of time has made very difficult to establish. The phone records question. In a modern investigation, phone records would be among the first things investigators sought. Who had Catherine called in the days before her disappearance? Who had called her? Were there communications with anyone who might have known about her planned errand that evening? In 1969, phone records were not the routinely accessible investigative tool they became in later decades. Obtaining them required specific legal process, and the records themselves were less comprehensive. There was no digital trail of recall made from every device, no text messages, no email, no location data embedded in communications. What investigators were able to establish about Catherine's communications in the period before her disappearance was limited. There was no documented evidence of threatening phone calls, no record of unusual or alarming communications that could be tied to her subsequent disappearance. But absence of evidence, particularly in a context where the evidence collection tools are limited, is not evidence of absence. The fact that investigators did not find documented threatening communications does not mean no such communications occurred. It may simply mean that they occurred through channels that left no recoverable record in 1969. What about Father Maskell's alibi? When investigators spoke to Maskell in the aftermath of Catherine's disappearance and then her murder, he provided an account of his whereabouts on the evening of November 7th. The specific details of that account have not been fully published in any source available to the public. Investigators generally do not publicly disclose the specific alibi claims of suspects who have not been charged, both for evidentiary reasons and for legal ones. What is known is that investigators at the time did not find his account sufficiently suspicious to pursue him as a primary suspect. The investigation in 1969 and 1970 did not center on Maskell in the way it would come to center on him after the survivor accounts emerged in the 1990s. When investigators returned to the alibi question in the 1990s, armed with the new context provided by survivor testimony, with the specific allegations that Maskell had both motive and opportunity, they looked at it with fresh eyes. What they found, according to accounts from investigators and journalists who followed the renewed investigation, was that Maskell's account of his movements on the relevant evening had inconsistencies. Not necessarily dramatic, flagrant contradictions, but the kind of inconsistencies that emerge when someone is reconstructing a past alibi. rather than genuinely recalling what they were doing. These inconsistencies were not sufficient to support charges. An inconsistent alibi is not the same as a proven false alibi, and a false alibi, while suggestive, is not the same as evidence of commission of the crime. But they fed the investigators' suspicion. They were consistent with the picture emerging from survivor testimony, a picture of a man who had something to hide about that evening. The geography matters here, and it is worth spending time on it. The Westgate Shopping Center, where Catherine's car was found, is in the southwestern part of Baltimore City. The field off Jar Avenue in Lansdowne, where her body was found, is in Baltimore County, just outside the city limits, a few miles from the shopping center. The drive between these two locations is not long. It is the kind of distance you can cover in 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the route. The area is one of overlapping neighborhoods and suburban development, familiar to anyone who grew up in or spent significant time in southwestern Baltimore. Archbishop Key High School is also in this general area. Father Maskell, as the school's chaplain, was intimately familiar with the geography of southwestern Baltimore and its immediate surrounding county. He had been working and moving through these neighborhoods for years. The field in Lansdowne was not a randomly chosen disposal site, not a place that required extensive local knowledge, but also not a place that a stranger would have identified easily. It was the kind of location that someone familiar with the area might have known about, might have driven past, might have been aware of as an unmonitored, out-of-the-way piece of land. Investigators noted this when they examined the disposal site in the renewed investigation. The choice of location was consistent with someone who knew the area. And Father Maskell knew the area, again. Consistent with, rather than proof of. But these consistencies accumulate over the course of an investigation. And their accumulation is part of how investigators develop the kind of picture that, in a better evidence case, would support charges. The question of what happened to Catherine between the shopping center and the field in Lansdowne is one that the physical evidence has never fully answered. Was she killed at the shopping center, or nearby, and then transported to the field? Or was she taken somewhere else first, somewhere more private, where whatever happened to her happened, and then transported to the field afterward? The condition of her remains when found did not allow investigators to definitively answer this question. There was no evidence at the shopping center, no blood, no physical disturbance. That would have indicated it was the primary crime scene. This suggests, though again does not prove, that she was taken somewhere else before she was killed. Where that somewhere else was, what building, what location, what private space, is something that survivor testimony has pointed toward, but that physical evidence has not confirmed. John Hargadon Wenner's account, which described Maskell bringing her to see Catherine's body, included location details that investigators examined. If the location Jean described was where Catherine had been held or killed before being moved to the Lansdowne field, it would have represented a potential crime scene that could be forensically examined. The challenges of acting on a specific location claim made decades after the fact, in terms of finding physical evidence that has survived the intervening years, in terms of the changes that may have been made to a location over time, are considerable. Investigators did examine locations connected to Maskell's history. Whether what they found at those locations advance a case is something that has not been fully publicly reported. Let's talk about the forensic examination of Maskell's remains in 2017, what it was intended to accomplish, and what it actually produced. When Baltimore County investigators announced they were exhuming Maskell's remains for DNA analysis, it represented a significant commitment of resources and a public statement that the case was being actively pursued. The decision to exhume was not made lightly. It required legal process, coordination with the church, and the kind of institutional commitment that signals genuine investigative intent. The goal was straightforward in concept. Extract a DNA profile from Maskell's remains that could be compared against any biological evidence recovered from Catherine's body or from the original crime scene. The execution was complicated. Maskell had been dead for 16 years at the time of the exhumation. Extracting a usable DNA profile from 16-year-old remains is technically possible. DNA can be recovered from bone and teeth long after death, but it requires careful laboratory work and depends on the condition of the remains, the way they were stored, and the specific genetic material available. Investigators were able to extract a DNA profile from Maskell's remains. The comparison was made against available evidence from the Cessnick case. The results, as Baltimore County investigators described them, did not produce a match that directly connected Maskell to the crime scene evidence. The DNA comparison was not the definitive forensic link that would have allowed prosecutors to say here is biological proof that this man committed this crime. This was a significant setback. Not a final answer as noted earlier. The absence of a DNA match does not establish innocence, particularly given the limitations of the original evidence collection, but a setback for those hoping that modern forensic science would provide the clarity that 5 decades of investigation had not. The case remained officially open. The investigation continued, but the forensic path forward had become significantly less clear. What about other potential suspects? It would be a mistake to present this case as if the investigation had only ever looked at Maskell. Responsible investigators examine all plausible possibilities, and the history of the Cessnick investigation includes attention to other individuals whose names arose in connection with the case. Edgar Davidson, the convicted sex offender whose name appeared in some survivor accounts and investigative reports, was examined as a possible participant. Davidson had a history of predatory behavior and had connections to the Baltimore area that put him in proximity, at least geographically, to the relevant locations and institutions. Some accounts suggested he may have been part of the network of abuse that Maskell allegedly ran, which would have given him both connection to the milieu and potential motive for wanting Catherine silenced. Davidson died before investigators could fully develop whatever case they might have been building around his possible involvement. There were other names, individuals whose identities have not been fully established in public reporting, people who appeared in survivor accounts as associates of Maskell, as participants in the abuse network, as people who might have had reason to want Catherine's investigation of that network shut down. Some of these individuals may still be alive. Some may have knowledge that could advance the investigation. The challenge of reaching them, of building enough of a case to compel testimony, of working through their own reasons to remain silent, is part of the ongoing investigative puzzle. The role of the Archdiocese of Baltimore, as a potential institutional actor, in the events surrounding Catherine's death, is something they have examined and have never been able to establish with legal certainty. The question is not simply whether individual priests or church officials knew about Maskell's abuse. The accumulated evidence makes it difficult to believe that no one in the institutional hierarchy had any awareness of what he was doing. The question is what specific individuals knew, when they knew it, and what specific actions they took in response. If church officials were aware of Maskell's abuse before Catherine's disappearance, and specifically if they were aware that Catherine knew about it, did they take any action? Did anyone in a position of institutional authority communicate to Maskell that his situation was becoming dangerous? Did anyone within the institution facilitate or enable what happened to her? These questions have not been answered. They may never be answered. The internal communications from the relevant period, whatever documentation exists of discussions about Maskell, about the abuse about Catherine, have not been made fully public. Legal proceedings have not produced the kind of institutional disclosure that might answer these questions definitively. What the available evidence suggests is an institution that, at minimum, allowed a known predator to continue in ministry and maintain access to children long after there was reason to question his fitness for that role. Whether the institutional failure extended to active participation in, or facilitation of, the specific crime against Catherine, the question that remains officially open. Let me bring you back, one more time, to the night itself, November 7, 1969, Baltimore. Cold, Catherine pulls into the Westgate Shopping Center parking lot. She goes into a store. She buys the engagement gift for her sister. She walks back out to her car. She puts the gift inside, and then something happens. Maybe she sees a familiar car nearby. Maybe someone calls her name. Maybe she sees someone she recognizes, someone she has no reason to be afraid of, someone who has always presented a face of kindness and pastoral concern. Maybe that person asks to speak with her. Maybe they express urgency, something important, something private, something that can't wait. Maybe they ask her to come with them for just a few minutes. And Catherine, who is 26 years old and kind and trusting, and who has no particular reason in that moment to be afraid of this person, says yes. She gets into another vehicle, or she walks to another location, and the door that closes behind her is the last door she ever walks through willingly. The silence that descended over that parking lot after Catherine left it, the ordinary November silence of a shopping center at night, cars coming and going, the ambient noise of a city at the edge of sleep, that silence contained something that the world would spend 50 years trying to hear. What happened next? Where she went, what was said, what she saw in the last minutes of her life. Whether she had time to understand what was happening to her, or whether it came too quickly for understanding. Whether she was afraid. These are the questions that no forensic analysis can answer. They are the human questions. The ones that live in the space between evidence and truth, in the place where the story of a person's life meets the fact of their death. And they are the questions that the people who loved Catherine Cesnik have been carrying for 50 years. The 1990s arrived with a shift in the American cultural landscape around the issue of childhood sexual abuse that had been building for years. It wasn't a sudden change. It was the product of accumulated pressure, survivors speaking, researchers documenting, journalists investigating, lawyers testing legal theories, therapists developing frameworks for understanding trauma that hadn't existed a generation earlier. It was the slow, grinding work of a society beginning to confront something it had spent a very long time not wanting to see. And in Baltimore, in the Southwestern Catholic community that had been shaped so profoundly by the institutions now under scrutiny, that shift would produce something specific and devastating. A civil lawsuit that would bring the name of Father Joseph Maskell into public record for the first time. That would force the Archdiocese of Baltimore to respond publicly to allegations it had apparently preferred to manage quietly, and that would reopen, with new urgency and new context, the question of what had happened to Sister Kathy. The women who would eventually become the plaintiffs in that lawsuit had been carrying what happened to them for a long time. Teresa Lancaster had been a student at Archbishop Cuff during Maskell's tenure as chaplain. She had been subjected to abuse that, by the time she was able to name it fully and describe it in legal terms, fell into categories that the law recognizes as among the most serious violations one person can commit against another. She had spent years navigating the aftermath of that abuse, the way it shaped her relationships, her self-perception, her ability to trust, before reaching a point where she was prepared to pursue legal accountability. John Hargadon Wenner's path to disclosure had moved through therapy, through the slow and painful process of confronting memories that she had dissociated from, through the gradual reconstruction of experiences that her mind had protected her from by placing them somewhere she couldn't easily reach. Both women had, through different routes, arrived at the same destination, a conviction that what had been done to them was a crime, that the institution that had enabled it bore responsibility, and that the passage of time was not a sufficient reason to remain silent. They found attorneys willing to take their case. They built the legal framework for a civil action against both Father Maskell personally and against the Archdiocese of Baltimore, the institution that had placed Maskell in his role at Cuff, that had maintained him there despite whatever internal knowledge or suspicion may have existed, and that therefore bore, the plaintiffs argued, institutional liability for what he had done. The lawsuit was filed in the early 1990s, and it immediately generated significant attention, not just because of the abuse allegations, though those alone were serious enough to demand attention, but because of what the plaintiffs said about Catherine Cesnik. The connection between Maskell's abuse and Catherine's murder was not incidental to the lawsuit. It was central to it. Teresa Lancaster and John Hargadon Wenner made specific, detailed claims about Catherine's knowledge of the abuse and about the relationship between that knowledge and her death. Teresa described going to Sister Kathy, telling her what was happening, being believed and held and promised action, and then watching Sister Kathy disappear. Jean described being taken by Maskell to see a body she identified as Catherine, as a method of threat and control. As a demonstration of consequence, these claims, when they became public through the lawsuit's filing, electrified the case. For the first time, there was a specific articulated theory of motive and connection, not just a suspicion that something was wrong, but a detailed account from named individuals who said they had direct knowledge of the relationship between what Maskell was doing and what had happened to Catherine. The Baltimore press covered the lawsuit. The story reached beyond the immediate community of survivors and former students to a broader public audience. People who had never known Catherine Cesnik, who had no connection to Archbishop Cuff or to the southwestern Baltimore Catholic community, were reading about a murdered nun and a priest accused of systematic abuse and an alleged cover-up that stretched across decades. The Archdiocese of Baltimore responded to the lawsuit as institutions typically respond to serious allegations defensively. Its legal team challenged the claims. It disputed the characterization of what church officials had known and when. It questioned the reliability of the survivor accounts, particularly that had emerged through recovered memory. It raised procedural defenses, including the statute of limitations argument that would ultimately prove decisive. The public posture of the Archdiocese was one of concern and regret combined with firm resistance to the specific legal claims being made against it. It expressed sympathy for anyone who had experienced harm. It pointed to its existing processes for addressing allegations of clergy misconduct. It did not, in its public statements, acknowledge the specific allegations against Maskell as true or concede that its institutional handling of the situation had been inadequate. Behind this public posture was a legal strategy aimed at defeating the lawsuit on procedural grounds before the substantive allegations could be fully examined. And that strategy ultimately succeeded. The statute of limitations issue was the central procedural battleground. In Maryland, as in most states, civil claims must be filed within a specified period after the alleged harm occurred. For the kind of claims the plaintiffs were bringing, claims arising from abuse that had occurred in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the standard limitations period had expired long before the lawsuit was filed. The plaintiffs' legal team argued for what is called tolling, a legal doctrine that allows the limitations clock to be stopped or reset under certain circumstances. Their argument was that the plaintiffs had not been able to bring their claims within the standard period because of the specific nature of their injuries. The abuse they had suffered had been so severe, and the perpetrator's manipulation had been so effective, that they had been psychologically unable to connect their current suffering to the abuse until the recovered memory process made that connection possible. This argument, sometimes called the discovery rule applied to repressed or recovered memory, was at the cutting edge of both psychology and law in the early 1990s. The science of trauma and memory was still developing. Courts across the country were wrestling with how to handle cases where survivors said they had not remembered, or had not been able to fully understand, what had been done to them until decades after the fact. The Maryland courts that heard the Maskell case ultimately ruled against the plaintiffs on this issue. The court found that the statute of limitations had run, and that the circumstances did not justify tolling it in the way the plaintiffs argued. The case was dismissed without a full hearing on the merits of the abuse allegations. The dismissal was devastating for Teresa Lancaster and John Hargadon Wenner, who had taken the enormous personal risk of coming forward publicly, of attaching their names to allegations that they knew would be challenged and scrutinized and attacked. The dismissal felt like a second violation. The legal system had not found them incredible. It had not ruled that their accounts were false. It had simply determined on procedural grounds that the time to seek legal remedy had passed. The distinction matters, but it is cold comfort. When you have carried something for 20 years, and finally found the courage to bring it into the light, being told that you took too long, regardless of why you took too long, regardless of the very specific reasons rooted in what was done to you, is a particular kind of cruelty. The archdiocese's legal victory was not, however, a complete strategic success, because the lawsuit, even in being dismissed, had accomplished something permanent. The allegations were now on the public record. Maskell's name was now associated in print with specific and detailed claims of systematic abuse. The connection between that abuse and Catherine's murder was now part of a documented legal proceeding that journalists and investigators and historians could reference. You cannot ring that bell. And in the years that followed the dismissal, the reverberations of that bell continued to be heard. Father Maskell, following the lawsuit and the attention it generated, was removed from active ministry. The laicization process, the formal removal of a priest's clerical status, is a significant step within the Catholic Church's disciplinary framework. It is not taken lightly or quickly. The fact that it happened in Maskell's case, in the context of the allegations made public through the lawsuit, represented an institutional acknowledgement that something was seriously wrong, even if the archdiocese continued to resist the specific legal characterizations the plaintiffs had offered. Maskell became, after laicization, a private citizen. He moved into relative obscurity. He was no longer Father Maskell in any official sense. The authority structures that had given him access to children, that had provided the institutional scaffolding for everything he had allegedly done, were withdrawn. But he continued to maintain his innocence. He spoke to journalists who sought him out in the aftermath of the lawsuit's public attention. He characterized the allegations against him as false, as the product of manipulated memories and motivated accusers. He presented himself as a man wrongly accused, a victim of a process that had allowed unreliable psychological theories to destroy a good person's reputation. He was, by multiple accounts, entirely composed in making this case calm, organized, articulate. The same qualities that had made him an effective manipulator of vulnerable teenagers were apparently available to him in the construction of his own defense narrative. Investigators who spoke to him in the renewed examination of Catherine's murder described the same quality. A man who answered questions without visible anxiety, who maintained his account consistently, who did not crack under the kind of pressure that, in innocent people, tends to produce either emotional distress or righteous indignation. Whether that composure reflected genuine innocence or the practiced performance of a skilled manipulator is a question that the investigators who encountered it answered differently in their own minds, and that the legal system never formally resolved. Baltimore County investigators, energized by the public attention the lawsuit had brought and equipped with the crucial new context of survivor testimony, made their most sustained effort to build a criminal case against Maskell during the mid to late 1990s. They had things they hadn't had in 1970. They had survivor accounts that provided a specific motive, the silencing of someone who knew about the abuse. They had a theory of the crime that was coherent and supported by multiple independent sources. They had the ability to apply forensic techniques that hadn't existed during the original investigation. What they were working against was formidable: the passage of time, the degradation of physical evidence, the deaths of potential witnesses, and the fundamental problem that the most powerful piece of evidence, the specific, detailed account of the person who had allegedly committed the crime, was not available to them. Maskell was not going to confess. The witnesses who might have direct knowledge of his actions on the relevant evening were either dead and inaccessible or unwilling to speak. Investigators conducted extensive interviews during this period. They spoke to former students, to colleagues of Maskell's, to people connected to the various institutions he had moved through during his career. They built a detailed picture of his behavior, his patterns, his relationships. Some of what they learned reinforced the case against him. Former colleagues described behaviors consistent with the profile of a predatory priest: the way he cultivated private relationships with students, the way he managed information and access, the way he positioned himself as indispensable to the people around him. Some of what they learned pointed toward the broader network that survivors had described, the suggestion that Maskell's abusive behavior was not entirely solitary, that he had connections to other individuals whose behavior was similarly predatory, that the protection he enjoyed may have extended beyond the church's institutional walls into other networks of power, and influence in the Baltimore area. One specific investigative thread that received significant attention during this period involved the question of law enforcement connections. Multiple survivor accounts included references to police officers or law enforcement figures in the context of the abuse, suggestions that Maskell had relationships with people in law enforcement that may have contributed to his ability to operate without consequences. The specific nature of these alleged relationships, whether they involved direct participation in the abuse, simple awareness and willful blindness, or active intervention to protect Maskell from investigation, was never fully established. But the suggestion that Maskell had cultivated protective relationships with law enforcement figures added a layer of complexity to the investigative picture. If investigators in 1970 had been operating in an environment where some of their colleagues had personal or professional reasons to look away from Maskell, it would help explain why the original investigation had not focused on him despite the circumstances pointing in his direction. This is speculative territory. The specific claims made by survivors about law enforcement connections were not verified in public legal proceedings. Investigators who worked the case in the 1990s have spoken generally about the challenges they faced without always specifying included interference or obstruction by other law enforcement personnel. What is clear is that the investigation faced obstacles that seemed disproportionate to what a straightforward cold case review should have encountered. Whether those obstacles reflected simple investigative difficulty, the natural entropy of a decades-old case, or something more deliberate is a question that has not been definitively answered. The question of what the Archdiocese of Baltimore knew, and specifically what it knew before Catherine's disappearance, acquired new dimensions during this period. Investigators and journalists looking at the institutional history began to piece together a timeline of what had happened with Maskell within the church's administrative structure. When had complaints first been made? When had supervisors first been alerted? What had been done, formally or informally? In response, what emerged from this inquiry was a picture that, while not fully documented in the public record, suggested that Maskell's behavior had generated some level of internal concern within the archdiocese prior to Catherine's murder. The extent of that concern, whether it constituted actual knowledge of specific abuse or only vaguer suspicion that something was wrong, was contested. The archdiocese maintained that it had not had specific knowledge of abuse prior to the allegations becoming public in the 1990s. Survivors and investigators questioned this characterization. What is documented is that Maskell was eventually transferred from CUF to other assignments, a movement that, read in context, looks very much like the kind of quiet institutional management of a problematic figure that has been documented in dioceses across the country. Moving a priest who is generating concerns from one parish or institution to another, rather than investigating and addressing the behavior directly, was a pattern that the national reckoning with clergy abuse revealed to be widespread and systematic. In Maskell's case, the transfers came after Catherine's murder. He continued at CUF for some time after 1969, but the question of what internal discussions may have preceded even those eventual transfers, and what they may reveal about institutional knowledge, remains one of the unanswered questions in this case. Let me tell you about the community that was forming around the pursuit of justice during this period, because it is one of the most remarkable aspects of this entire story. Former students of Archbishop Q High School had been quietly connected to each other through the years in the way that alumni of any school maintain loose networks. But the lawsuit, and the public attention it generated, began to pull those networks into something more purposeful. Women who had been teenagers in the late 1960s and early 1970s, women now in their 40s, with careers and families and the accumulated experiences of adult life, were finding each other and beginning to talk about what they remembered, about what they had seen or heard or suspected at the time, about the things that had seemed slightly wrong in ways they hadn't had the vocabulary to describe when they were young. Not all of them had been directly abused by Maskell, but many of them had been in the environment he had shaped. They had seen how he interacted with students. They had noticed things. a girl who seemed distressed after a session with the chaplain, a pattern of private meetings that seemed unusual, a quality in his behavior that, looking back from the vantage point of adult knowledge, felt wrong in ways it hadn't fully registered at the time. These women began to organize. Informally at first, conversations at reunions, letters exchanged, phone calls made. Then more deliberately, as the civil lawsuit gave them a focal point and a context for their gathering concern. Gemma Hoskins and Abby Fitzgerald Schaub were among the women who threw themselves most completely into this organizing work. They were not lawyers or investigators. They were former students who had loved their teacher and who had never been able to accept that her murder had gone unpunished. Gemma had been in Catherine's English class. She remembered specific things, the way Sister Kathy had engaged with her students, the warmth she had brought to the material, the particular quality of attention she gave to each person she taught. These memories were not abstract, they were specific and vivid and personal. And they made the injustice of Catherine's unsolved murder something that Gemma felt not as a general social concern, but as a personal wound. Abby brought her own memories and her own fierce determination. Together, the two women became something that the official investigation was not: a persistent, dedicated, resourceful force that refused to accept the idea that the passage of time was a sufficient reason to stop looking for the truth. The work that Gemma and Abby did in the years following the lawsuit, and continuing into the 2000s and 2010s, was extraordinary in its scope and its impact. They gathered documents, old-school records, personnel files where they could be obtained, any paper trail connected to Maskell's career and Catherine's life and death. They filed public records requests with law enforcement agencies, seeking whatever had been documented about the case over the decades. They conducted interviews, spoke to former students, to former teachers, to anyone who had been part of the CUF community during the relevant years and who was willing to talk. They built a network of contacts that extended across the country, tracking down women who had graduated and moved away, who had carried their memories in private for decades and who, when finally asked, were willing to share what they knew. They followed specific investigative threads that the official investigation had not fully developed. They looked into Maskell's history at other assignments, what had happened at the parishes and institutions he had worked at before and after Q, whether there were other victims, other complaints, other patterns consistent with what the Q survivors described. What they found, the picture they assembled across years of painstaking work, was not exculpatory. It was a detailed, documented history of a man whose predatory behavior appeared to have been consistent, sustained, and enabled by institutions that should have stopped it. They shared what they found with investigators. They pushed for the official investigation to follow up on specific leads they had identified. They maintained pressure on the Baltimore County Police Department and on the Archdiocese to keep the case active and to pursue accountability. The death of Father Maskell in 2001 hit this community hard, not because they mourned him. No one who had spent years documenting what he had done to those girls had any grief to spare for the man himself, but because his death foreclosed possibilities. The chance that he might eventually be charged, that a criminal trial might force a full public airing of the evidence, that the legal system might deliver some formal measure of justice. Those possibilities died with him. What remained was the case itself, technically open, and the determination of the community to keep it that way. In the years between Maskell's death in 2001 and the release of the Netflix documentary in 2017, Gemma and Abby continued their work. They built the Facebook group, a digital gathering place for the community of people connected to this case that grew to tens of thousands of members and became a remarkable collective intelligence. Pooling memories and information from hundreds of sources, they stayed in contact with Baltimore County investigators. They stayed in contact with journalists who were interested in the case. They kept the story alive in the particular way that determined organized civilians can keep a story alive, by refusing to let it become simply a historical footnote, by insisting that it was still a live question, by generating the kind of sustained attention that eventually attracted the interest of documentary filmmakers looking for stories that have to be told on a larger stage. Ryan White, the director of The Keepers, has spoken about how he came to the story through the Facebook community, through the remarkable women who had built it, through the recognition that what he was looking at was not just a cold case documentary, but a story about community and grief and persistence and the specific ways that institutions can fail the people they are supposed to protect. The documentary, when it was released on Netflix in May 2017, found an audience that was both enormous and deeply engaged. People watched it and immediately went online to discuss it. The Facebook group that Gemma and Abby had built saw its membership surge dramatically in the days and weeks after the documentary's release. People who had no connection to Baltimore, who had never heard of Archbishop Kiff or Father Maskell, found themselves pulled into the story, into the grief of it, into the outrage of it, into the determination of the women who had spent so much of their lives pursuing something they still called justice. The documentary was praised for its craftsmanship and its emotional honesty. It was also criticized, in some quarters, for the certainty with which it presented Maskell's guilt, for constructing a narrative that left relatively little room for alternative explanations. These criticisms were made by people who felt the documentary's advocacy exceeded what the evidence could definitively support. The survivors and their supporters largely rejected this criticism. They had not spent decades pursuing accountability for the sake of narrative balance. They had pursued it because they knew, in the way that people who have lived inside a truth know it, what had happened, and they believed the documentary accurately reflected the weight of evidence and testimony that pointed in one direction. The public response to The Keepers produced tangible investigative consequences. Baltimore County Police, facing renewed public pressure and a massive new audience for the case, committed publicly to the continued pursuit of the investigation. They announced the exhumation of Maskell's remains, a dramatic step that signaled genuine institutional commitment to following the evidence wherever it led. The Archdiocese of Baltimore issued statements in the documentary's wake that went further than its previous public positions in acknowledging the reality of abuse. The specific language of those statements, how much they conceded and how much they continued to resist, was parsed carefully by survivors and their advocates, who found the acknowledgments partial and the continued resistance to full institutional accountability frustrating. Several former students who had not previously spoken publicly came forward in the documentary's aftermath. The combination of seeing their own experiences reflected in others' accounts, and the sense that the public was now paying attention in a way it hadn't before, created conditions that made disclosure feel both safer and more worthwhile than it had before. New investigative leads were generated. The documentary brought the case to people who had relevant information, people who had seen or heard things in the relevant period and who, for various reasons, had not previously come forward. Whether those new leads produced anything that materially advanced the official investigation is something that has not been fully reported publicly. What did the documentary not resolve? Everything legally. Nothing about The Keepers produced the formal accountability, the charge, the trial, the verdict that the survivors had spent decades seeking. It produced conversation. It produced a powerful, broadly watched public account of the evidence and the institutional failures. But Maskell was still dead. The statute of limitations on civil claims was still a barrier. The physical evidence was still limited. The murder of Catherine Cessnick was still officially unsolved. The documentary did something that is harder to measure, but perhaps equally important. It changed what could be said publicly about this case. It made certain facts, the abuse, the cover-up, the connection to Catherine's murder, part of the broadly shared public record in a way that previous reporting and the dismissed lawsuit had not fully accomplished. That matters, not legally, but in the human sense in which truth matters, in the sense in which the people who were harmed deserve to have the truth or harm acknowledged. It matters. Teresa Lancaster had died in 2015, 2 years before the documentary was released. She had lived long enough to know that the effort was continuing, that Gemma and Abby were still working, that the Facebook community was growing, that journalists were interested and investigators were still engaged. She had not lived to see the massive public response to The Keepers. The way the story she had fought so hard to tell was finally being heard by millions of people. Her death, before that moment of public acknowledgement, is one of the quiet tragedies that runs alongside the louder ones in this case. The survivors who come forward and spend years fighting for accountability don't always get to see the fruits of that fight. Sometimes the fight outlasts them. Jean Hargadon Wenner was alive to see the documentary and its impact. She had spoken on camera with a clarity and a courage that left viewers in no doubt about the reality of what she had experienced. The public response to her account, the letters, the messages, the expressions of belief and solidarity from strangers who had watched and been moved, represented something she had been denied for decades: the experience of being believed by the world. It was not justice, but it was something. The years following The Keepers brought renewed energy to an investigation that had been running, in one form or another, for nearly 5 decades. Baltimore County Police maintained their public commitment to the case. Cold case investigators continued reviewing evidence, following new leads generated by the documentary's massive audience, and pursuing forensic possibilities that modern science continued to open. The exhumation of Maskell's remains had not produced the definitive DNA match investigators had hoped for, but it had not closed the door either. The investigation remained active, officially and genuinely. New survivors continued to come forward. Women who had watched the documentary and recognized their own experiences in what others described. Women who had carried their silence for decades and found, in the public acknowledgement the documentary represented, something that finally made speaking feel possible and worthwhile. Gemma Hoskins and Abby Fitzgerald Schaub continued their work. The Facebook community they had built remained active, a living archive of memory and testimony and collective determination that showed no signs of dissolving. The Archdiocese of Baltimore, as part of the broader national reckoning with clergy sexual abuse that had been accelerating since the Boston Globe's landmark reporting in 2002, faced continued pressure to release internal documents related to Maskell and to other accused clergy. The question of what those documents might reveal about institutional knowledge, about who knew what and when, remained one of the central unanswered questions in the broader story of which Catherine's murder was a part. Maryland's legislature, responding to the national conversation about statutes of limitations in clergy abuse cases, began examining whether the legal barriers that had defeated the 1990s civil lawsuit should be reformed. Whether survivors of childhood sexual abuse should have a longer window in which to bring civil claims regardless of when their memories became accessible to them. These legislative conversations represented something important: a recognition that the legal framework itself had been part of the problem. That the same institutions that had failed survivors internally had also benefited from legal structures that made external accountability difficult to achieve. Catherine Cesnik remained at the center of all of it. Her name, her face, her story, kept alive by the people who have loved her and refused to stop. The murder of Catherine Cesnik has never been officially solved. That sentence carries a weight that is difficult to sit with, particularly for everything we have walked through together. The survivor testimony, the forensic efforts, the decades of work by investigators and by the extraordinary community of women who refused to let Sister Cathy be forgotten. All of it, and still no formal resolution. Still no verdict. Still no moment in a courtroom where someone stood and answered for what was done to a 26-year-old nun on a cold Nova night in Baltimore. And yet, the truth of this case, the human truth, the moral truth, the truth that the people who lived inside it have known for a very long time, is not genuinely in doubt. A young woman found out that children in her care were being harmed. She could not look away. She made a promise to act. And she was silenced before she could keep that promise. That is what happened. Not legally proven, but known. Catherine Cesnik deserved better from every institution that was supposed to protect her. From the church that employed her abuser and shielded him. From the legal system that dismissed the survivor's claims on procedural grounds. From the investigators who in 1969 lacked the context to see what was in front of them. From a world that took 50 years to listen to the women who were trying to tell the truth. But she was not forgotten. She was remembered by the girls she taught, women now, in their 60s and 70s, who still cry when they talk about Sister Kathy. She was remembered by survivors who carried the double burden of their own abuse and their knowledge of what had happened to the woman who had tried to save them. She was remembered by Gemma and Abby and the thousands of people in that Facebook community who kept her name alive when official institutions had moved on. She is remembered now by you, listening tonight. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything she would have wanted to be known, to be held to the people whose lives she touched. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please leave a comment and subscribe. Good night, and stay safe.